welcome you to our QA session. Good afternoon. My name is Christiane Reinhold. I am with Accenture and serve as the local government and private nonprofit FEMA reimbursement lead supporting the New York State Division of the budget efforts on mitigating the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd like to go first over some housekeeping items here. As you already noticed, as Jessica, our host, has noted, all audience microphones are muted throughout the duration. And since we are going to be a lot of people, please make sure to send questions you may have through chat. This is obviously a QA session, so we very much depend on you asking questions. When you do that, please make sure that you select all participants. It's one of the options in chat. That way, everybody can see what you're asking, and most importantly, the panelists can see it, so they can grab your question, read it out, and then the team from the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services can respond. Also, if you think of it, and I know it's hard, tell us what organization you're with so we know who asks what. Please also note, since we are so many and you may have a lot of questions, we may not be able to respond to all of your questions, but rest assured we are capturing all your questions through the chat log, and we will post an update to our FAQ. The FAQ you can certainly access through the Grants Gateway website. You've got the URL in the chat, so it's not going to get lost. As we already noticed, if you have any technical issues, please send a chat to our tech facilitators, both Jessica Litwin and Sam Mataraza, or if all fails, send an email to dob.sm.training@budget.newyork.gov. Again, please note the session is being recorded, and we will make that recording available to you also on the Grants Gateway site. There's a microsite specifically stood up for nonprofits and their potential questions around FEMA reimbursement. So let me see here, and now I'm going to move this over here. Got that covered. Go to the next slide here. So you may all remember, probably rather vividly, the previous administration issued a major disaster declaration for New York last year on March 20th, with the incident period having been backdated to, in fact, January 20th, 2020. So this means that eligible expenditures for activities that you may have conducted in direct response to the pandemic on or after January 20th last year could be submitted to FEMA for reimbursement. The incident period for this disaster is currently open-ended. However, we now anticipate that FEMA will establish an end date for the incident period potentially sooner rather than later. So there is a bit of sense of urgency now that we didn't have a couple of weeks before. So that's why we figured we would follow up the FEMA orientation sessions you may have attended back in mid-June, would follow it up with a QA session. So that's a little different. This session will be relatively unstructured. There won't be a presentation. Instead, we really depend on you to ask the questions you have come with. You may have questions on eligibility, on how to qualify, on how to potentially get reimbursed for labor costs, etc. And so that's what we are prepared to answer today, and maybe even have some kind of conversation going. So while Chris Warner with the divisions of the budget will make some introductory remarks so you understand where this initiative even comes from, I will be showing you a slide with topics that we expect you may have questions about. And again, I encourage you to please start putting your questions into the chat. Please remember, select all participants so all speakers can see your questions. And with that, over to Chris, and I'm showing you the slide.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As Christiane said, my name is Chris Warner, and I'm with the State Budget Office. And I, along with numerous individuals here, have been working diligently over the last year, committed to maximizing the level of federal grant assistance flowing into the state, including any federal aid that may be available to the state's not-for-profit entities. It was encouraging to see a number of the state's not-for-profit entities attending the earlier information sessions coordinated by this group, and now attending today's session on question and answers. It's important that the not-for-profit entities have the information they need to determine if and how FEMA resources may be available to them in response to the pandemic. We recognize the vital role of your organizations in partnering with the state in the delivery of various public services, and we view the possible availability of FEMA grant assistance as an important step in ensuring the nonprofit sector can continue with the business of serving New York State residents. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Christiane. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I am watching the chat log, and let me quickly say a few words about this slide that you're seeing. So this is not written in stone, but we figured with a lot of attendees here and 1 hour available, we figured we are focusing on some questions or some areas, I would say, that we have found generate a lot of head scratching, right? Particularly around qualifications. How do I qualify to be an applicant even? What's entailed? What do I have to do? Where do I go? Who and what is actually eligible? Is there some kind of date or time sensitivity around that? Then also there's a lot of anxiety around the work being actually an organization's legal responsibility. So how do I find that out, whether I'm legal responsible for doing X, Y, Z, because that will determine whether your expenditures could be eligible. And then finally, a lot of questions generally are around labor or workforce costs, both for full-time but also for part-time or temporary resources that you may have brought on board. What does the landscape look like in terms of reimbursements? So those are the core areas that we thought you might be interested in and may have most of your questions. It's not written in stone, it's just to guide us. Please feel free now to put your questions in so we can directly respond. And the last 10 minutes, we were hoping to open QA to just about everything. You may have questions outside of 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we'd be happy then to get to it at that point. And as I said before, if we run out of time, then we will update our FAQ and you will be able to find answers on the Grants Gateway site. So I see there is some questions coming in. So in this case, I'm going to hand it on over to Evelis, Kevin, and Crystal. Are you ready to pick the questions, read them out loud so the team from Dishes can answer?
We sure are.
Great. So feel free. I see.
I will take the first one from Vicki from the Dance New York. First, I want to follow up with a question for Vicki if the Dance New York is an educational facility. So if it is an educational facility, then the organization would potentially be eligible for FEMA reimbursement. Of course, that determination is made by FEMA once you submit the request for public assistance. If you haven't done so already, that probably needs to be done really quickly. If you are determined to be an eligible organization, there are several activities for certain different time periods for responding to COVID, such as sanitation and any way to protect your staff and your students.
Was that you, Crystal, in fact?
That was me, Crystal. I'm not sure if Evelise is able to, she said that she is on, but she's not sure if she can unmute herself.
Okay, so really...
Yes, I am here.
Okay, so the question was...
Good.
Okay, good.
And finally they made it, yes.
Yeah, so the question really was, would you be able to confirm if an art service organization would be eligible for FEMA reimbursement? That is one part of the question for DISHES, and there's a little bit of a follow-up. Our organization undertook significant activities to respond to COVID-19 for the dance field. So what take would the DISHES team have on this?
And
Hi, this is Andrew Martin from DISHES Recovery. So there's a couple different elements to this question. So for private nonprofits, the first step is to determine the PNP applicant eligibility. And FEMA must first determine if a nonprofit organization is an eligible applicant for federal disaster relief through the following. They need a current ruling from the IRS granting tax exemption under 501C, D, or E of the Internal Revenue Code, or documentation from the state substantiating that's a non-revenue producing nonprofit entity organized or doing business under state law. Additionally, to obtain private nonprofit applicant eligibility, it's also required that FEMA determine whether the nonprofit provides the appropriate services through an eligible facility if the facility provides a critical service defined as education, utility, emergency, or medical, if the facility provides a non-critical but essential social service to the general public, i.e. not restricted based on certain limiting factors, and if the facility restricts access but clearly in a manner that is related to the operations of the facility. If the organization can prove its nonprofit status along with meeting the criteria for eligible facilities, then FEMA will move ahead with determining the eligibility of the facility that provides the emergency service. And for nonprofit organizations, the operating facility must be eligible or work to be eligible for reimbursement. So per the Stafford Act, that the facility is a building or work system like a wastewater treatment plant or water distribution plant, obviously not the case here.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Andrew. There was, I think she put in a little bit of a follow-up here from Vicky. She says it's not an educational facility or a service organization for the dance field. So if that changes anything, then you should be following up. Back to Evelise, I think I've seen some eligibility questions popping up a little further down. I see a lot also on PPP, so we'll save those a little bit for later.
So this is from Eric Ross. Will we be eligible to apply for non-personal expenses if we received a PPP loan?
Hi, this is Rihanna from DISHES. PPP loans are outside of the public assistance FEMA funding that we're talking about today. I'm not quite sure, Christian, if you guys have someone on your team who specializes in PPP loans. Unfortunately, that is not under the auspice of PA funding.
Understood, yeah. We can take that as a side question, and it's not going to get lost, and see whether we can get some guidance on PPP loans. There is another question, PPP loans, so let's jump that. Evelise, if I see one down here, I think on eligibility, that's also PPP. Interesting. We have a lot of that. This one is interesting by Juliana Cope. You see it. Does pre-K funded by City of New York qualify if run by a private nonprofit? And do after-school programs qualify?
So, I mean, generally speaking, P&Ps can be eligible applicants for FEMA public assistance based on what I just said a few minutes ago. You know, there are certain activities and services and supplies, materials that are eligible for reimbursement. It's not clear from the question exactly what's being asked, if it's about services or materials, but as an applicant, private nonprofit that meets those definitions that I just stated a few minutes ago could potentially be eligible applicants for FEMA public assistance, and we can work with you directly if you send us an email at DishesPA COVID-19 at dhses.ny.gov.
So, Juliana, just to recap, as far as being qualified as a possible applicant for FEMA PA, based on the information you provided, it would appear that you would jump over that barrier. And then as far as what expenditures you would have that would possibly draw down reimbursement from FEMA, most likely, I'm thinking most of the potential applicants or applicants that are on the call today would be looking for reimbursement for disinfecting and PPE given your non-medical status. So just to kind of frame that out for you. So back to you, Christiane.
Okay, I see a question by Colby Cyrus from Interfaith Works in Syracuse, and he's asking, wondering if our services, refugee resettlement and other human services, are eligible for FEMA reimbursement.
Thank you for that question. Again, this is Rihanna from Dishes. FEMA at this time under COVID-19 disaster 4480 does not reimburse expenditures associated with relocation of individuals under that sort of explanation. Like I said before, the majority of what would be applicable for the population on this call today would be around disinfecting, distribution and usage of PPE in order to preserve safety for individuals that you have responsibility for. So kind of let me just spin a little story around that last question. Perhaps associated with that service of relocating and working with families in the human services world, maybe you incurred expenditures for PPE, maybe you abided by the CDC disinfecting rules for certain settings that were open to the public. Things like that, we can work with you once you you can use the email, go to our website, Dishes Recovery, and come in contact with us to see if you qualify as a applicant, and then we can help you walk through some of your expenditures that you've incurred back to January 20th of 2020 to see if they are eligible to draw down public assistance reimbursement. Do keep in mind, for those of you, most of you have already sat in on many of our presentations, but for some of you that have not, there is a minimum threshold of $3,300 for a project. So if, let's say, for instance, your expenditures going back to January 20th of 2020, to date only coming in about $2,000, while you may be an eligible applicant, you wouldn't have enough in expenditures to file with public assistance FEMA. However, if you had around $3,300 and you were deemed an eligible applicant, then we can continue to work with you to formulate your projects and help usher you through the public assistance process to get that reimbursement. Back to you, Christiane.
Thank you so much, Rihanna. So I think I found another, maybe related one, from Lorraine Coleman, and she asks, is a not-for-profit, low-income, affordable housing property qualifying as essential?
Hi, this is Andrew from Dishes again. So in many disasters, there is a distinction between critical private nonprofits and non-critical but essential private nonprofits in terms of eligibility. But for this disaster, which is the only type of work that is eligible for reimbursement, is Category B, emergency protective measures, there's no difference in between who is eligible here. Either both critical and non-critical but essential PMPs are both eligible applicants for this disaster.
All right.
So again, Christiane, just to frame that for Lorraine, while you may be a eligible applicant, the question that we would then, if you reached out to us, ask back is, what kind of expenditures are you looking to get reimbursement on? Assuming if you had affordable housing property, if you had a main office to serve your clientele and you had to distribute PPE to your employees and members coming in and out for these services, as well as, abiding by the CDC guidance around disinfecting, and those alleged expenditures were in excess of $3,300, then potentially you would have a project that could be submitted and to receive FEMA funding. So before we move on, Christiane, just so that way we can level set for some of the individuals asking questions, we do have our website that was provided above in the chat box for DSH's recovery, where you can go through some of our applicant briefings to see some of the broad brush rules around public assistance funding under FEMA, such as that $3,300 minimum threshold that I mentioned before, and then also, as was said earlier, I believe by Chris and Christiane, is that this incident period continues to be ongoing. It does go retro to January 20th of 2020. So this is quite possibly, or it is, the longest incident period we've ever experienced under a FEMA declaration. We are one of all states and territories have this declaration ongoing. So the time period in which you can accumulate expenditures still has not ended. But again, please be mindful that you have to have at least $3,300 of eligible expenditures. And for the audience that we're speaking to today, the majority of that would be in PPE provision, as well as disinfecting within CDC guidance to align with that. So just to level set there. So back to you, Christiane.
Sure. I think I've got a really interesting question here. It's fairly long, from Nicole Peterson. She asks here, she is from the Arts Center of the Capital Region, 501c3. We offer art making classes to children and adults and also host BOCES classes. I really don't know what that is. We ourselves are not an accredited educational institution, but we opened our building and brought out staff back so the BOCES or BOCES classes could run in person in September. Oh, this is a PPP question. We did get PPP funding, which has been forgiven. So I'm wondering whether that is even anywhere near going FEMA.
Well, also one thing to note when applying for public assistance under FEMA reimbursement is that we do have requirements around not supplanting costs and not having a duplication of benefits. So it sounds like, Nicole, your organization has already secured funding through the PPP, which I will own that I don't know what that is, but based on this messaging, it sounds like it was a type of loan that was provided. Therefore, it sounds like all the expenditures associated with bringing your staff back and continuing with your programming has already been reimbursed. Therefore, there would be no expenditure in excess of that PPE funding. But if I misunderstood that, Nicole, and you do have expenditures for PPE and for disinfectant and or, please respond in the chat box and we can tailor our response to that. Back to you, Christiane.
Great. Thank you, Rihanna. This one is from Nancy Carbone from Friends of Firefighters. She says, we provide mental health services to New York City firefighters and their families. We had to purchase laptops and software to transfer our services to a virtual platform while still paying the rent to keep our main location. We closed all of our other sites. Do we qualify for reimbursement?
So it says that they received PPP, which was forgiven for that. So
that was the previous question. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So
I can reread it.
No, it's okay. For the laptops and software, that is not an eligible expenditure under public assistance FEMA, so that is not an eligible expenditure. But again, if you did PPE, personal protection equipment, and that could be like face mask, cloth mask, not necessarily the N95s, or you were disinfecting your common spaces or spaces by opening or reopening according to CDC guidance, we would be able to go through those expenditures that have not already been reimbursed by another funding stream. I believe it was quoted the other day that there's upwards of 50 various funding streams from the federal government that have been released for different purposes. So we recognize that PA FEMA funding is one of many out there, which is typically not the case when we have a disaster declaration under FEMA. So we know that there's a lot of opportunity for reimbursement for certain expenditures, but again, PA FEMA funding is for mostly in this population, given that you're non-medical facilities, is for PPE and disinfecting. Back to you, Christiane.
Thank you. So we have a question from Aaron Reiner, and he asks what cost categories are permitted for submission for funding. And he lists several examples here. And I think I know already the answer for the first two or three. Telehealth expansion equipment, telehealth consulting fee, PPE cost, space mediation, increased cost for employment, and the like. So we are talking about telehealth, both equipment and consulting, but then we also have PPE cost and an increased cost for employment and space mediation. So I think the latter three have potential. Rihanna or Andrew, what do you think?
If you're for space mitigation, we would have to get more information on that. If you were talking about having to acquire more space, therefore increasing your operating costs in order to accommodate the mandated or recommended by CDC 6 foot apart, that is not an eligible expenditure. However, in that narrative, it was mentioned PPE as well as disinfecting. That would potentially, depending upon, again, were you close to the public, were you open, some other little caveats there, but that could potentially draw down, and provided it was not already reimbursed by another funding stream, that could potentially qualify for PA reimbursement, and then we would just caution that it would have to be at least $3,300 in eligible expenditures in order to put forth a project with FEMA. Back to you, Christiane.
Great, thank you. So we have a question here from Teresa Monforte Caraballo, and she asks, if we had to hire a driver to deliver food bags to clients with COVID, is that covered? Also, the cost of the additional food needed to be distributed to those with COVID and senior shut-in, would that be covered? I'm trying to reread it.
No, we're discussing it here. There's a lot there to unpack. So that may actually be covered depending upon the location of the organization by another entity. So if they did not experience the expenditures themselves, they may actually be under the umbrella of another reimbursement under public assistance. So I would highly recommend they reach out directly to the centralized email that was provided earlier. So that way we can dig in the dishes PA COVID-19 at dishesny.gov. So that way we can get into the specifics, because there may be pieces within what was stated that are eligible, but again, we would definitely need to verify that, one, the alleged expenditures are in excess of $3,300, and we would need to unpack to make sure there's no duplication of benefits. As far as the food, that may be under a different program, but once we have that conversation, we can, again, unpack that. Back to you, Christiane.
Great, that's great advice. So yeah, this is for anybody who has some very unique situations. Do feel free to reach out to Dishes. We will flash up the information again, how to get a hold of them, so you can get an answer. I have another question here from Emma Kilroy. She is with the Center of Urban Pedagogy. In order for an organization or facility to be an eligible applicant, do all eligible activities need to take place in the facility or on site? For example, some of our youth education work takes place in schools.
So not necessarily, but there does need to be, so we have to establish a couple different things for eligibility. We have to establish an eligible applicant, and that PMP can be an eligible applicant if it meets the certain criteria we discussed earlier, and they have to own or operate an eligible facility. Services that take place or that are offered by the organization may or may not qualify them as an eligible applicant, but if there are services or activities that are provided off-site in another location, that shouldn't make a difference in terms of the eligibility for the applicant as long as they own or operate a facility in New York State.
Depending upon what expenditures are being asked for reimbursement. So with that, again, not knowing the specifics, Emma, if you're talking about certain handouts or someone else had mentioned technology and computers, that is not eligible as a COVID-specific policies state under DR 4480, the COVID disaster. That is not eligible for FEMA PA reimbursement. So it would really depend, are we talking about PPE usage? Of course, if the individual needs that while on your site and then they take it, we don't expect you to take it back and dispose of it. So if that's sort of your line of thought, that could possibly be sufficient if you have at least $3,300 in eligible expenditures for that, and then disinfecting. So again, that's one we could possibly dig in deeper. What I would ask is, of course, reach out. We can go through these with our staff with you. Just if you can pull together at least an idea of what expenditures you believe you've incurred. Again, retro to January 20th of 2020, and provided you did not already get reimbursed for those expenditures through another local, state, or federal funding stream, then they could potentially, if you are an eligible applicant, be eligible for reimbursement. Back to you, Christiane.
Sure. I see a very fundamental question here, which I think is great and maybe of interest to a lot of attendees. And it comes from Erin Baskin from the New York Life Arts. She asks, can you explain the process to see if our nonprofit is eligible for FEMA funding? So we're really getting more into the steps that would, once you contact DISHES, so what would be the steps to determine am I eligible as an applicant, and then are my expenditures eligible? If you, Rihanna or Andrew, could take us through that.
Okay, Christiane, we're going to break it down into two pieces. What you need in order to determine whether or not you are an eligible applicant. Go ahead, Andrew.
So yeah, like I talked about a little bit earlier, I need to demonstrate that the organization is a 501c, D, or E. That's really the first step. And you'll need to provide a series of documentation to us that we can review. That would include the organization's DUNS number from Dun & Bradstreet, the organizational charter and bylaws, the tax-exempt letter demonstrating the 501c, D, or E designation, articles of incorporation. There's a questionnaire that's on our website and on the FEMA grants portal site that needs to be addressed. It's called the PMP questionnaire. And you'll need to provide a copy of the organization's deed or lease agreement demonstrating that you own or operate an eligible facility in New York State. And you can download that entire package from our website, the DISHES website. Now, as far as facilities, for many cases, there may not be a facility that's damaged like you would have in a traditional disaster like a hurricane or a storm event. But even though that's the case, private nonprofits still must demonstrate that they operate an eligible facility in order to be considered an eligible applicant. And to do that, there are some requirements for the facility. It must be the legal responsibility of the applicant, and we'll dig into that as a separate whole other topic. It must have been in active use at the time of the emergency, i.e. now we have an ongoing open incident period. And those are really the critical steps right there.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. I have a question here where I may want to flip over actually to the other slide that we kept in reserve. It talks a little bit more about the time sensitivity of eligibility. So the question from Andrea Ryan is, are PPE and disinfection costs reimbursable for non-medical settings prior to the policy change date of January 1st, 2021 that made those expenses eligible for shelter, daycares, food assistance programs? And I think you may want to spend a little bit of time looking at the, if you will, categories here on the left side that you see, and then the different eligibility periods. You see them dated starting when the incident period began, January 20th. And that was the first one all the way to September 14th last year. And then we had an interim eligibility period that lasted from September 15th, 2020 to January 20th, 2021. And now we are in the third period. And we have put a date of September 30th right now on there as an end date. It's not confirmed, but I think we should spend a little bit of time, Rihanna and Andrew, if you could, to guide our audience through the different eligibility that applies to these categories depending on in what time frame they fell. I think that is something that is very important and people need to know about. And I think Andrea kind of touched on that with her question.
Okay. So we talked about PPE, personal protective equipment. And as Christiane said, yes, there are 3 potential eligibility periods within the COVID disaster, DR 4480. We are clear that prior to September 15th, for the most part, if you are an eligible applicant, and again, the cost of your expenditures that has not already been reimbursed, that portion has not been reimbursed by other funding streams, there was a more open possibility for eligibility initially from January 20th of 2020 through September 14th of 2020. Then come September 15th per the chart of 2020 through January 20th of 2021. It depends. There is limited eligibility, it's very specific criteria, but again, once you have gone through the process and worked with our staff, we can walk you through that time period. Then starting January 21st of 2021, the eligibility for PPE opened up wider, similar to what happened in January of 2020. What we can do here at Dishes, if you believe you meet the criteria as an applicant and you did experience expenditures and costs that were not already reimbursed by other funding streams that are in excess of $3,300, we have staff that can walk through those expenditures that you provide to us, and then we can look at those 3 different time periods to see what exactly you could possibly put into a project to then submit to FEMA for public assistance reimbursement. Also, as Christiane mentioned, for cleaning and disinfecting, we had limited eligibility from January 20th of 2020 through September 14th of 2020 with very specific documentation. And again, there are policies. Actually, the slide that Christiane is sharing right now is on our website along with other information surrounding each of these eligibility periods. If you go to our website, it can be located there. So for cleaning and disinfecting, starting September 15th of 2020 through January 20th of 2021, there was limited eligibility for cleaning and disinfecting. along with very specific criteria outlined in our policies that are passed down from FEMA. Then starting from January 21st of 2021, you'll see that the eligibility under the updated policy is wide open. It has the green check mark, so it's typically less requirements around that, but there are certain things such as you have to be an applicant, and then you have to demonstrate not only the lack of duplication of benefits from other funding streams, but also the purpose surrounding cleaning and disinfecting. So you do have those provisions around there. And again, the slide that Christiane is sharing on her screen can be found on the DISH's website along with the accompanying PowerPoint for our applicants' briefings. Back to you, Christiane.
Great, thank you so very much. And I just had a great question, which seems to be shared by a couple of people, and now I can't find it anymore. My chat did jump, and it was, I think, from Temple Israel. Here we go. Yes, I found it. Jamie Cohn from Temple Israel, and a religious nonprofit, asks, and so do many others, in terms of would MERV 13 filters for our HVAC systems be eligible? And then I found down here, Juliana Cope asked something very similar. Are items like air filters, desk guards, signage allowable in addition to PPE? So there's a lot of questions around how to make the office safer, and those improvements, would they be eligible?
So very good questions. As you can see in the chart that is on your screen, temporary physical barriers were very, very limited from January 20th of 2020 through September 14th of 2020. And then from September 15th of 2020 to January 20th of 2021, it had to meet very specific criteria. But then starting January 21st of 2021, the updated policy opened up eligibility for temporary physical barriers. But again, we would need to understand and dissect with you why they were put up, how that temporary barrier fit into your protection around the individuals in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So, you know, it's not just the actual placement of the temporary physical barriers, but also the reason around the need for them that could potentially make that expenditure reimbursed, assuming that it was not already covered by another funding source.
Great. Thank you so very much, Brianna. I have received now some open questions as well that we haven't touched on. So let me start with that. I know it's not 10 minutes to, but I think maybe those questions are very worthwhile. Aaron Reiner asks whether a nonprofit needs to show an operating deficit to qualify for funding.
I apologize, you cut out. An operating what?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Does a nonprofit need to show an operating deficit to qualify for funding?
That is not a requirement in order to draw down public assistance under FEMA. We are not looking for deficits in operations. However, we do take into consideration if you have other funding streams that you've already utilized to reimburse those expenditures. But no, there is no need to require a deficit. Back to you.
Right. We have Jeff Levi. He asks, are services for people with developmental disabilities eligible? And he's talking about staffing, training staff on COVID-19. So services for people with developmental disabilities.
Okay, that would be something that we'd have to unpack with you. We would need to know who you are licensed and or certified by. Most likely you're on under the licensure or within a contract of a state agency or maybe a locality. So we would just need to unpack that a little bit to see if the PPE and or disinfecting that you're utilizing within your settings would be eligible for PA reimbursement. So again, we do have that centralized email address, the DSHS PA COVID-19@dshsny.gov, that if you want to reach out, we can unpack that with you and have further discussions, because perhaps you do qualify as a non-medical PNP, or perhaps someone may have filed something on your behalf. It would depend. Back to you, Christiane.
That sounds good. I have another question here from Dan Wollavander, and he asks, are COVID testing costs eligible? We have over $20,000 in these costs.
Thank you for that. Given that this is non-medical PNPs that were the audience of this presentation, it would very much depend. The policy around testing has been very specific, and you can see in the chart above there are periods where it's reimbursable in certain conditions and settings, and then other settings and conditions aren't. But given that this presentation is for non-medical PNP, we would have to dig into that a lot deeper to see why the organization felt the need to test versus a hospital per se, where it may have been a local mandate for them to test. So again, we would, encourage you to reach out to that DSHS PA COVID-19@dshs.ny.gov email, and then we would be more than happy to unpack that with you. Back to you, Christiane.
Yep, and I wanted to just repeat, we will put into the chat towards the end of this session the email to DSHS that Rihanna has now several times mentioned, along with the URLs to some other resources that are specific to PNPs. I would recommend, once it's showing up on chat, it's also at the very top of your chat. If you were to go up there, you can just copy paste them out and have them at the ready. So just wanted to repeat that. I have an interesting question from Tanya Bobran from Elite Learners Nonprofit in New York City, and she asks, would our food pantry services be eligible? We did not offer this before COVID, but because of COVID.
Great question. It would depend if you had an agreement with your local government. It looks like you're in New York City, so Andrew?
Yeah, let me hop in here. So private nonprofits cannot be eligible applicants or they cannot be reimbursed directly for these types of services and programs for COVID-19 public assistance. The activity and the commodities themselves may be eligible for reimbursement, but only through a state, local, tribal, or territorial government. So if a private nonprofit had an agreement or contract with an SLTT to provide these goods and services, they would get reimbursed directly from that SLTT, and the state, local, tribal, territorial government would be potentially eligible to receive reimbursement from FEMA. So it's the secondary down the chain, if that makes sense. But a PNP could not get reimbursed for these activities directly for this disaster.
Okay. Right, let me just jump one back, because I'm thinking we may want to touch on something that it didn't really show up in the chat stream, but I think we should talk a little bit about labor costs, full-time employees versus those that may have come on a temporary basis in response to COVID-19, and what the eligibility would look like there. Brianna and Andrew, if you could enlighten us when it comes to force account labor.
Sure. So for force account labor, overtime hours only are eligible for full-time staff. For temporary staff, all hours, regular and or overtime, is eligible for reimbursement.
This is very important to note. and obviously all of that has to be documented. FEMA depends on you having good documentation, and that is I cannot repeat it enough. We would have to have that at the ready. We also haven't really talked or touched on, we have sort of, but not really out loud, the legal responsibility of an organization and what this is, because FEMA will be looking at that, whether an organization actually had in their charter written out what it is that they are supposed to do, why they exist, right? Could you please, Andrew and Brianna, explain a little bit further on that one?
So like you just said, those rules about hazardous duty pay must already exist in the organization's charter. They must have already established that hazardous duty pay will be X, Y, or Z under certain circumstances. If that hazardous duty pay rule was enacted after the beginning of COVID-19, that's not going to fly with FEMA. It had to have been on the books already prior to the start of the incident period in order for FEMA to consider reimbursement for that additional hazardous duty pay.
Great. Thank you so much. And we have a question that probably goes through the heads of many here. Sue Friedlander says, yeah, we have a start date of January 20th, 2020, but what's the end date? And our best take on that one.
So we currently, as mentioned before, this is an open incident period. I recognize for those of you that may be familiar with FEMA public assistance funding, this is unusual. Typically, your incident periods are less than a week, maybe even only a day, given the nature of this pandemic and the ongoing efforts and the ongoing needs. As of now, the incident period for the disaster 4480, referred to as COVID-19, is open-ended. We have no indication as to when that incident period is going to end. As I mentioned before, it goes back to January 20th of 2020, so we're well over a year and a half into the incident period for this disaster. Again, there's never been an incident period this long. We, again, are not aware of when the incident period will end. FEMA has stated in written policy that they would provide us upwards of 30-day notice to let us know when the end period would be. So eligible expenditures within that time frame of January 20th of 2020 through the time in which FEMA announces and states what the end of the incident period is. Any actions taken that are otherwise eligible could potentially be reimbursed for public assistance FEMA reimbursement. But again, right now, we are unaware of what the end of the incident period is going to be per the federal government, but they will give us that 30-day notice. Back to you, Christiane.
Yeah, thank you, Rihanna. Yeah, so that's why I think we are getting a sense also now with the hurricane season picking up that FEMA is eager, I don't know if that's the right word, but is looking at least to come to an end, accepting requests for public assistance. Hence this session, there is a bit of a sense of urgency we wanted to convey here. So you don't miss out. I would also really recommend take advantage of DISH's availability to dig into your potential claims to see whether you are, as an applicant, eligible and whether you have eligible costs. From what I'm hearing, there is lots of potential. The state of New York, like Chris Warner said at the very beginning, really would like to secure each and every dollar possible to make New York as whole as possible. So I would say, again, take advantage of it. I would now ask, Lena, could you please again post in, you already have, you're so fast. So please pay good attention right now to the chat log. It says useful resources for PNPs. So you will find on the very bottom I don't know, so when I highlight something, you probably won't see it, but the Dishes email address where you can initiate essentially your questions. It's again DHSES PA all one word, -19@dishesnewyork.gov. And above it are several URLs. They all go back to a site you might be very familiar with. It's typically called the Grants Gateway of New York State. We have established there a microsite that's specific to FEMA and PNPs. So you find all sorts of resources there, among other a recording of our orientation session along with the deck. We also recently published a quick guide, which might also help. The FAQ sits there as well. So, and we will post there as well our session recording from today for you to access. So again, I hope you can see it. If you cannot see it, then we'll have to figure out another way, maybe sending out via email these resources one more time. Also, please revisit your invite that you originally got. It also had links in there through which you can access resources that are provided by Dishes and by FEMA, but I would really recommend to work through Dishes and not approach FEMA directly. Right, Rihanna and Andrew, that is not how this works. You will have to work through Dishes first.
That is correct.
Yeah. So feel free, this is right there for you at the ready and available. And I would also shudder having to think I would have to deal directly with a federal agency. So therefore, Dishes is the perfect buffer and your first line of defense to look at your specific situation and assess whether it is worthwhile for you to go through it and get you then expedited as quickly as possible. FEMA, in fact, pushed an expedited process out because of COVID. So it's not quite as onerous as it normally would be with different disasters that you may be aware of, like snowstorms or flooding or so forth. But there is still a lot of due diligence, and Dishes stands by to help you understand what is required, what to collect, and so forth in order to make your case and get reimbursed. So we hit the 3 o'clock mark. I thank you so very much for attending. I hope you found it useful. And again, you're not on your own. Please feel free, reach out, make use of the resources we have developed. And I would like to wish you a good rest of the day. And thank you very, very much for attending. Thank you, Dishes team. Thank you, Atkins team. Thank you, Jessica and team, to get this session underway and also concluded. Thank you so very much, everybody.